I need to start this the way I've started telling it to everyone who's asked, which is with a disclaimer. I am not a person who believes in ghosts. I never have been. Growing up, when my cousins would tell stories around the campfire about the lady in white who walks the train tracks outside our hometown, I was the annoying kid who explained how sound travels weird through fog and how headlights can trick your eyes on a curve. I debunk things. That's just who I am. I'm an electrician by trade. I like things that make sense, wires that go where they're supposed to go, currents that behave the way currents behave. So when I tell you that something impossible happened to me starting last October, I need you to understand that I am the last person who wanted this to be real. It started on a Saturday morning in a town called Brindlewood, about 40 minutes outside Cleveland, Ohio. I don't actually live in Brindlewood. I live one town over in a rental with my dog, a mutt named Biscuit, who's the real hero of this whole story. Honestly, because dogs know things before we do. I was in Brindlewood that morning because my buddy Jesse had asked me to help him move a couch. And afterward we decided to walk around the neighborhood because apparently the whole town does this thing every fall where everybody clears out their basements and sells their junk on their front lawns. Community garage sale day. Half the town was out on their porches with folding tables, and the other half was wandering around with cash in hand, looking for a deal. I wasn't planning on buying anything. I want that on the record. I was just walking Biscuit, half listening to Jesse complain about his landlord, when a table outside a small blue house caught my eye. Mostly the usual stuff. Picture frames with the photos still in them, which always creeps me out a little, like who's selling a frame with some stranger's dead grandmother still smiling in it. A stack of board games missing half their pieces, some yellowed paperbacks, a shoebox of cassette tapes nobody was ever going to buy. And then, off to the side, half covered by a folded tablecloth, I saw the camera. It was old. Genuinely old. Not thrift store old. The kind of camera you'd see in a black and white photo of someone's grandfather standing outside a diner in 1958. Black metal body, worn down to bare silver in spots where a thumb would naturally rest. A leather strap that had cracked with age, and a manual focus ring that still turned smooth when I picked it up and tried it. There was a strip of masking tape on the bottom of the camera, and on it, in faded blue ink that had clearly been written decades ago, was a name. R. Halloway. An older woman came out from the house when she saw me holding it. She had that look people get when they're selling things that used to belong to somebody, not quite grief but something adjacent to it. I asked her how much for the camera. She hesitated. It wasn't a normal hesitation, like she was doing math in her head about pricing. It was longer than that. She looked at the camera like she was trying to remember how it had ended up on that table in the first place. "That wasn't supposed to be out here," she said finally. I asked if that meant it wasn't for sale. She looked at it a moment longer, and then she said, "No, you can have it. Just take it. Please." She didn't ask for money. She practically pushed it into my hands, and something about the way she said, "Please," like she was relieved, like she'd been waiting for someone to take it off her hands for a long time. Should have told me to put it back down and walk away, but I didn't. Because $5 or free, a working vintage camera that still turns and clicks after 60-something years is a cool thing to have on a shelf, and I am, in hindsight, an idiot. I thanked her. Jesse made some joke about me turning into a hipster who was going to start a film photography Instagram. Biscuit sniffed the camera bag once, backed up 2 full steps, and would not go near it again for the rest of the walk. I noticed that. I want to be honest and say I noticed it and I ignored it because dogs are weird about all kinds of things, and I told myself it probably smelled like the old woman's house or mothballs or whatever. That night, back at my apartment, I dug through a drawer in my closet and found 2 rolls of unused 35mm film left over from a photography elective I took in college almost 8 years ago. I'd never actually gotten rid of them, which in retrospect feels like fate laughing at me, because if I hadn't had that film sitting around, none of the rest of this would have happened, at least not the way it did. I loaded a roll into the camera. Took some fumbling. I'd forgotten how manual cameras work. You don't just point and shoot, you have to actually wind the film forward yourself after every picture. But I got it going. I spent about 20 minutes wandering my apartment taking test shots. Biscuit lying on the rug. My coffee table covered in mail I hadn't opened yet. The view out my kitchen window at the parking lot below. Nothing special. I just wanted to see if the thing actually worked. I dropped the film off the next morning at a 1-hour photo place downtown. Yes, one of those still exists, a little shop wedged between a nail salon and a defunct video rental store, run by a guy who's probably in his 60s and looks personally offended every time someone brings in a memory card instead of actual film. I went back that afternoon to pick up the prints. There were 24 photos on the roll. I had taken 12. The first 12 matched what I remembered. Biscuit, the coffee table, the parking lot. Grainy, a little washed out from the old camera's light leaks, but normal. The next 12 were not photos I took. They were all of the same hallway. Not my hallway. I don't have a hallway like this. My apartment is a one-bedroom with a straight shot from the front door to the living room. This was a long, narrow corridor with wallpaper peeling in strips near the baseboards, a bare bulb hanging from a wire in the ceiling, throwing this sick yellow light over everything, and at the far end of the hallway, barely inside the frame, there was a shape. Person. Standing perfectly still. In the next photo, the person was slightly closer. And the next. And the next. 12 photos, 12 small increments, like watching someone approach in slow motion, or like watching 12 individual frames pulled out of a longer film reel of someone walking down a hall toward whoever was holding the camera. I stood at that photo counter just staring at the stack in my hands, and the kid working the register, high school age, bored out of his mind, leaned over and said, "Whoa, that's creepy. Did you do that on purpose? Like double exposure or something?" I said no. I said it out loud, to a stranger, in a shop that smelled like chemicals and burnt coffee. "No, I didn't take these." He laughed, assuming I was joking. I did not correct him. I want to walk you through my own internal logic at that point, because I think it's important for you to understand that I fought against believing this was anything supernatural for a long time. My working theory, standing right there in that shop, was that this was old, undeveloped film. Maybe somebody, at some point, opened the camera in a dim room and loaded a partially exposed roll without realizing there were already images on it. Double exposure through negligence, not through anything haunted. That's a real thing that happens with old film cameras. It made sense. I felt, for about 4 hours, genuinely fine about the whole thing. Until I got to the 12th photo. The last one. The one where the figure in the hallway is closest to the camera, close enough that if this had been an actual video instead of a photograph, you'd expect it to keep walking right out of frame and into whatever room the camera was sitting in. The face was blurry. It's an old camera. Everything on these photos has a kind of soft, dreamlike blur to it. But there was enough there. Enough to see that the person in the photo was not looking at the camera. They were looking down, at their own hands, and their hands were pressed over their mouth, like they were either about to scream or trying to physically stop themselves from making a sound. I put the camera in a kitchen drawer that night, wrapped in a dish towel, and told myself I was done with it. I was not going to develop another roll. I was going to sell the thing on some vintage camera forum, or better yet, just throw it away and move on with my life. That resolve lasted 4 days. I want to be honest about why it broke, because I think it matters for understanding everything that happened after. It wasn't idle curiosity, not entirely. It was that on the third night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of Biscuit growling. A low, continuous growl, the kind he only does when someone's walking past our building outside at night, except he was staring directly at the kitchen. At the drawer. I got up. I checked the drawer. The camera was exactly where I'd left it, wrapped in the towel, untouched. But the drawer itself was open about 2 inches, and I distinctly remembered closing it all the way. I told myself the apartment building was old, and drawers slide open sometimes with settling, temperature changes, whatever. I closed it again. I went back to bed. Biscuit did not stop growling for almost 20 minutes. The next morning, I looked up the name on the tape. Halloway. It didn't take much digging. Brindlewood has a small historical society that's digitized a good chunk of the old local newspaper archive, mostly because some retired librarian made it her mission project a few years back, and within about 10 minutes of searching I found an obituary from 1974. Ruth Halloway, 61 years old. Described in the obituary as a well-known local photographer and longtime member of the Brindlewood Camera Club, survived by a brother in another state, no children. Cause of death was listed plainly. House fire, ruled accidental on Miller Street. Miller Street, I would later find out, is 3 blocks from the Blue House where I'd been handed this camera for free by a woman who clearly could not wait to get rid of it. I sat with that information for a long time that morning, coffee going cold in front of me, Biscuit's head resting on my knee like he could tell something in me had shifted. I still didn't believe in ghosts. I want to be clear about that. But I no longer believed this was a coincidence either, and that distinction between this is supernatural and this is not a coincidence is exactly the crack in my own logic that this whole thing crawled through. Because the thing about a crack like that is once it's there, once you've admitted even that much, it gets wider every single day. And I had no idea, sitting in my kitchen that morning with a stack of impossible photographs in a drawer 6 feet away, that I had barely scratched the surface of what Ruth Holloway had left behind. I didn't know yet about the other cameras. I didn't know about the other names. It didn't take much digging. Brindlewood has a small historical society that's digitized a good chunk of the old local newspaper archive, mostly because some retired librarian made it her mission project a few years back, and within about 10 minutes of searching I found an obituary from 1974. Ruth Holloway, 61 years old. Described in the obituary as a well-known local photographer and longtime member of the Brindlewood Camera Club, survived by a brother in another state, no children. Cause of death was listed plainly: house fire, ruled accidental on Miller Street. Miller Street, I would later find out, is 3 blocks from the Blue House where I'd been handed this camera for free by a woman who clearly could not wait to get rid of it. I sat with that information for a long time that morning, coffee going cold in front of me, Biscuit's head resting on my knee like he could tell something in me had shifted. I still didn't believe in ghosts. I want to be clear about that. But I no longer believed this was a coincidence either, and that distinction between this is supernatural and this is not a coincidence is exactly the crack in my own logic that this whole thing crawled through. Because the thing about a crack like that is once it's there, once you've admitted even that much, it gets wider every single day. And I had no idea, sitting in my kitchen that morning with a stack of impossible photographs in a drawer 6 feet away, that I had barely scratched the surface of what Ruth Holloway had left behind. I didn't know yet about the other cameras. I didn't know about the other names. And I definitely didn't know that the woman on Miller Street hadn't been the only person to hand this exact camera to a stranger and beg them, without quite saying the words, to please take it far away from her. That part of the story, the part where I found out I wasn't the first person this had happened to, and wouldn't be the last, starts with a second roll of film. A roll I loaded myself, brand new, straight out of factory packaging, because I needed to prove to myself once and for all that there was nothing already inside that camera waiting to come out. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but I was most wrong about that. The fresh roll of film cost me $4 at a drugstore, which felt almost insulting given what it was about to do to my life. I bought it specifically because I needed proof. I needed to stand in my own kitchen, open the packaging myself, feed the film into the camera with my own hands, and watch every single step of the process so that no part of my brain could later tell me maybe there was old film already loaded in there, maybe somebody switched something, maybe I miscounted. I even took a picture of the sealed film canister on my phone before I opened it, time-stamped, like I was building a case file for a trial that hadn't happened yet. Biscuit sat in the doorway of the kitchen the entire time, not coming closer, not looking away either, just watching. I loaded the film. I took 12 photos over the following 2 days, all completely mundane, all things I could vouch for from memory with total certainty. My laptop open on the kitchen table. My bookshelf, the one with the crooked shelf I keep meaning to fix. Biscuit asleep in the exact spot of sunlight that hits the living room floor every afternoon around 3. My own reflection in the bathroom mirror, which in hindsight is a detail I wish I'd left out of this story, because of what came back later. I dropped the roll at the photo shop on a Tuesday. I picked it up on a Wednesday. 24 photos again. My 12 were exactly as I remembered them. The other 12 were the hallway. Same peeling wallpaper. Same single bulb hanging on its wire, throwing that sick yellow light. Except this time, the figure wasn't at the far end of some hallway I didn't recognize. The figure was in my apartment. First photo. Standing beside my bookshelf, half turned away, like it had just walked into frame from somewhere off to the side. Second photo. Standing directly behind Biscuit in that same patch of sunlight on the living room floor, except the light seemed to bend strangely around wherever the figure stood, like it was somehow both in the room and not quite touching it. Third photo. In my bathroom mirror. Not reflected in the mirror the way I would be if I were standing in front of it. Behind the glass. like something looking out through the mirror rather than being caught in its reflection. And the last photo, the 12th one, the one that made me physically drop the entire stack onto my kitchen floor and take 4 full steps backward, showed the figure standing directly behind where I would have been standing to take that exact photo. Not blurred by distance this time. Close enough that if I had turned around while taking that picture, whatever this was would have been closer to me than most people stand in an elevator. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with every light in the apartment on, biscuit pressed against my leg the entire time, refusing to settle until the sun came up. The second the Historical Society opened its doors, I was standing outside waiting. The woman who worked there, Diane, was somewhere in her 60s, the kind of local historian who has strong opinions about which old buildings deserve to be torn down and which ones the town council was criminally neglecting. I mentioned Ruth Holloway's name, expecting maybe a polite blank stare followed by her looking the name up in a filing cabinet. Instead, her whole face changed. She went quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like she was deciding in real time how much she wanted to tell a total stranger who'd walked in off the street. "Where did you hear that name?" she asked. I told her, more or less honestly, that I'd come across a camera that used to belong to a Ruth Holloway, and I was curious about the history. Diane sat down. She didn't invite me to sit, but I did anyway. She told me Ruth had been a fixture in Brindlewood for most of her adult life, well-liked, active in the local camera club, the kind of woman who took the class photos every year at the elementary school and photographed every wedding and christening within a 15-mile radius, free of charge because she genuinely loved doing it. But sometime in the early 1970s, Diane wasn't exactly sure when it started, only that people began to notice Ruth changed. She stopped taking pictures of people. She started photographing empty rooms, empty hallways, empty stairwells in buildings she had no obvious reason to be inside of. She'd knock on strangers' doors and ask, with total sincerity, if she could take a few photographs of their basement, or their attic, or the space behind their furnace. Most people humored her because she'd always been kind to them. A few got uncomfortable enough to stop letting her in. She told my mother once, Diane said, that she believed something followed people. Not ghosts of the dead. Exactly. Something else. Something that had never been alive to begin with, that lived in the spaces between rooms, and that a camera, an old-fashioned one, film, not these newer ones, could sometimes catch it if you photographed the right empty space at the right moment. She said most people go their whole lives without a photograph ever catching it. She said she'd caught it. More than once. And she said once it knows you can see it, it doesn't like being unseen again. I asked Diane, as calmly as I could manage, whether Ruth had ever said what happened when it knew you could see it. Diane looked at me for a long moment before she answered. She said it starts trying to get closer. The fire, Diane told me, had started in Ruth's home darkroom, in the back of her house on Miller Street, in the winter of 1974. Officially ruled accidental, old wiring, developing chemicals, a plausible enough combination. But she told me something that had stuck with the older folks in town for decades afterward. Ruth's body was found nowhere near her darkroom equipment. She was found in the hallway of her own house, sitting against the wall, hands pressed over her mouth, as if she'd been waiting for something rather than trying to escape a fire at all. I felt the blood leave my face when she said that. Hands pressed over her mouth. Exactly like the figure in my very first roll of film, the one from the hallway I didn't recognize. I asked what happened to Ruth's belongings after she died. Diane said most of it was handled by a brother who lived out of state and didn't want anything to do with the estate. Sold off through an estate sale within a few months, cameras included, and from there, who knows? 50 years of secondhand sales, yard sales, boxes passed down through families who had no idea what they were holding on to. I went home that night and did something I'm not proud of, but which felt necessary at the time. I sealed the camera inside a plastic bag, drove back to the blue house on the street where the garage sale had been, and left it on the porch with a note. I didn't sign my name. I just wrote, "I'm sorry. I can't keep this." I didn't knock. I didn't wait to see if anyone came to the door. I drove straight home and didn't look in my rearview mirror once, which is a strange thing to be proud of, but at that point I was taking whatever small comfort I could get. For 11 days, nothing happened. Biscuit stopped growling at empty corners. I slept through the night again. I genuinely started to believe that giving the camera away had ended it, that whatever had followed Ruth Holloway around for the last years of her life had simply moved on to wherever it went next, and that I'd gotten out lucky, with nothing worse than some very bad dreams and one deeply unsettling stack of photographs I kept meaning to throw away and somehow never did. On the 12th day, my phone rang. It was the 1-hour photo shop downtown. I hadn't dropped off any film. I want that stated clearly. I had not been inside that shop in almost 2 weeks. The kid on the phone, the same one from before, I recognized his voice, told me someone had come in that morning and dropped off a roll of film with my name and phone number written on a sticky note attached to the canister, asking specifically that it be developed and that I be called personally to come pick it up, no explanation given. I asked him what the person who dropped it off looked like. There was a pause on the line that went on just slightly too long. "That's the weird thing," he said. "I didn't actually see anybody come in. I just found it sitting on the counter when I opened up this morning. Whoever left it must have slid it through the mail slot or something. But the note had your name on it so clear as day I just figured you dropped it off yesterday and forgot." I told him I hadn't. I told him not to develop it. I told him to throw the entire roll away, unopened, and I would pay him for his trouble. He laughed, assuming I was joking, the same way he had the first time. I did not correct him, the same way I hadn't the first time either. I drove to that shop faster than I should have, and by the time I got there, he'd already developed it. He said it only took him a couple minutes since I called right after he'd started the batch, and that he figured I'd want to see them since I'd gone through the trouble of asking him not to. I want you to understand that I stood at that counter and I begged a bored 17-year-old not to hand me an envelope of photographs, and he handed them to me anyway because to him it was just pictures, and because he had absolutely no idea what I already knew. There were 24 photos in that envelope. Every single one of them was the hallway. And in every single one, the figure was closer than the last, moving not toward some anonymous person who might have been holding a camera, but toward whoever it was that would eventually be standing exactly where I was standing, in that shop, at that counter, looking down at pictures of something that had apparently never stopped looking for me, even after I thought I'd given it away for good. I didn't know it yet, but giving the camera back hadn't ended anything. It had only proven something far worse, that whatever this thing was didn't actually need the camera to still be in my possession to find its way back to me. And that meant getting rid of it again wasn't going to be nearly as simple as leaving it on a stranger's porch. I drove home from that photo shop with 24 pictures of a hallway getting closer to me sitting on my passenger seat, and the entire way there I kept glancing at them like they might rearrange themselves if I looked away for too long. I want to walk you through the next stretch of time carefully because I've told this part of the story to a few close friends and the reaction is always the same. A kind of disbelief that isn't about whether it happened but about how I managed to keep functioning through it. The honest answer is that you don't really have a choice. Life doesn't pause just because something impossible has attached itself to you. I still had to go to work. I still had electrical jobs booked, breaker panels to replace, outlets to install in a house that was being flipped on the other side of town. I did all of it in a kind of fog, running on maybe 3 hours of sleep a night, jumping at shadows, checking my phone constantly because I'd developed an irrational fear that the Photoshop was going to call again. It didn't call again. Not for a while. That should have been a relief. It wasn't, because the absence of that particular warning sign just meant whatever this was had found a different way to reach me. It started with sounds. Small ones, at first easy to explain away. A creak in the hallway outside my apartment door at night that I told myself was just the building settling. The same building that had settled every single night for the 4 years I'd lived there without producing a sound like this. A soft, dragging sort of shuffle like slippers on carpet, except my building doesn't have carpet in the hallway. It has that thin, cheap laminate flooring that makes a very specific hollow sound under footsteps, and this wasn't that sound. This was softer. Wetter, somehow, though I know that doesn't quite make sense as a description of a sound, but it's the only word that's ever felt accurate. The first was from a user with an account that had clearly been made that same day, no post history, nothing. The message was short. I had a camera like that. Old, black metal, name on tape at the bottom. Mine said D. Prescott. I gave it away 8 years ago. Things still happen sometimes. Delete this account after you read it. The second was longer, from someone claiming to be a woman in her 50s in Pennsylvania, who said her late aunt had owned a similar camera decades ago, and that her aunt had spent the last years of her life sleeping with every light on in the house, convinced something followed her from room to room, and that after her aunt passed, the family found dozens of undeveloped rolls of film, hidden in a floorboard under her bed that nobody had the nerve to get processed. The third message is the one that changed everything because it wasn't vague at all. It was from a man named Colin, and he said flatly, "I'm a paranormal investigator, and I've heard variations of this exact story 4 times over the last 6 years. Same details. Old camera, name on tape, hallway with a bulb hanging from the ceiling, figure getting closer photo by photo. This isn't random. There's a pattern here and I think I know part of it. Please don't ignore this message. I don't think you're in as much danger as the others were, but only if you understand what you're actually dealing with." I'll admit my first instinct was skepticism. The internet is full of people who insert themselves into viral stories for attention, and paranormal investigator is not exactly a credential that inspires trust on a first read. But something about the specificity of what he'd said, the hallway, the bulb, the figure getting closer photo by photo, details I hadn't actually included in my original post because I'd left them out to keep the story shorter, made my stomach drop. I messaged him back and asked how he knew about the bulb and the hallway if I'd never mentioned them. His response came almost instantly, like he'd been waiting for me to ask exactly that. "Because it's the same hallway every time. I don't think it's a real place. I think it's the space this thing actually exists in, and the camera is just a window that lets it look through into wherever you are. The people who see it get closer in the photos aren't being stalked toward their own homes. It's the opposite. Something in their own life, in their own house, is being pulled closer to that hallway. And once it fully arrives, the person who owned the camera stops being able to tell the difference between their house and that hallway at all." I didn't sleep again that night, obviously. I sat with my laptop open, going back and forth with Colin for hours, and slowly the shape of something much bigger than one haunted camera started to take form. He told me that as far as he'd been able to piece together across the handful of similar cases he'd investigated, this had started with Ruth Holloway, but it hadn't ended with her death in 1974. Whatever she'd found, or whatever had found her, had outlived the fire that killed her, attached itself to the physical camera or cameras she'd used, and had been passed hand to hand across 5 decades through estate sales, thrift stores, yard sales, each new owner going through some version of exactly what I'd gone through. Curiosity, unease, escalating dread, and eventually an attempt to give the thing away, which worked for some people and, according to Colin, had very much not worked for others. I asked him what happened to the ones it didn't work for. He didn't answer that question directly, not that night. He just said we needed to figure out how many cameras were actually out there, because his working theory, one he admitted he couldn't fully prove, was that Ruth Holloway hadn't owned just one camera capable of capturing this thing. She'd owned several, and whatever had followed her all those years, it hadn't been contained to a single body, a single lens. It had learned to move between them. That night, lying in bed with Biscuit curled tight against my side, refusing to settle, I heard the shuffling sound in the hallway outside my apartment door again. Except this time it didn't stop at my door. Stopped and then, slowly, unmistakably, I heard it try the handle. My door was locked. It stayed locked. Whatever was on the other side eventually moved on, the shuffling sound fading back down the hallway the way it had come, and I lay there in the dark for the rest of the night with my hand wrapped around Biscuit's collar like that was somehow going to protect either of us. In the morning, I found something on my welcome mat that had absolutely not been there the night before. A single photograph, curled slightly at the edges like it had been sitting somewhere warm, showing the hallway again, the bulb, the peeling wallpaper, except this time the figure in the frame wasn't approaching from the far end anymore. It was standing directly outside a door. My door. I recognized the numbers on it. 4C. The exact numbers on my own apartment door, visible at the very edge of the frame, close enough to read. I called Colin the second I found it, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I heard something in his voice that sounded less like professional detachment and more like real, immediate concern. "Okay," he said. "I need you to listen to me very carefully because I think we're running out of time faster than I expected, and I need to tell you exactly what I've learned about how many of these cameras Ruth Holloway actually made, and why the number matters more than you'd think." I didn't know it that night, sitting in the dark with Biscuit's collar wrapped around my hand, that what Colin was about to tell me would change everything I thought I understood about this camera. Because it wasn't just one. There were more of them out there, and every single one was connected to the same thing that was standing outside my door. If you want to find out how many cameras Ruth Holloway really made, and why that number changes everything. The next part is coming very soon. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it, because trust me, you're gonna want to know how this gets worse before it gets better.